My name is Jack, and I'm a member of a walking group called the Trail Walkers Society. We're a community dedicated to enjoying the pleasures of hiking and exploring nature, as well as working to protect the outdoor spaces people cherish. I know it might sound dull, and I'll admit that a lot of our members are retirees with thick jackets or enthusiasts who dream of being survival experts. But long walks aren't the reason I joined the society. When you learn about our history, you realize that we've actually been involved in some pretty intense moments. To keep it brief, the walking movement started in the late 1800s. At that time, wealthy landowners wanted to close off huge parts of the countryside and turn it into private land. This sparked outrage and led to protests in the form of mass trespassing. There were conflicts, arrests, and injuries. It was a big deal, eventually leading to the passing of a law that ensured public rights to access certain lands. So when you go out for a walk, you're not just taking a leisurely stroll, you're exercising the right to enjoy beautiful natural places. And to me, that's a meaningful part of what we do. I usually tell people this when I want to spark their interest in the group. We're all about spreading the message. But there are things I leave out when talking about rambling, because if I were to mention them, it might actually scare some people away from exploring nature altogether. If you go walking in forests, hills, or woodlands regularly, you're bound to have a few strange experiences, maybe even some that make your hair stand on end. Since I've already bored you with the group's background, I'll share a creepy experience I had while rambling near a town called Hereford in the UK. I was walking through a dense forest near an area known as the Black Wood. I came across a small clearing that didn't seem like much at first. I wasn't planning to walk into it. It was drizzling, and the trees were offering shelter. But something caught my attention when I noticed what looked like a floating ball of grass. It reminded me of one of those strange visual effects you might see in an old film. I just stood there staring at it for a moment as it gently swayed in the breeze. When I got closer, I realized it wasn't floating. It was actually hanging from a branch of a tall oak tree. Someone had crafted a ball out of grass and tied it to the branch with twine. Being the curious person I am, I walked over to investigate. As I approached, I saw it wasn't exactly what I'd first thought. From a distance, it looked like some tangled grass, but up close, it appeared to be solid turf. It was like someone had cut a patch of grass from a lawn, rolled it up into a ball, and somehow tied it to the tree. There were no visible seams. It looked almost like a miniature planet hanging there, perfectly crafted. I couldn't help but be amazed by the skill it must have taken to create it. Whoever made it had clearly put a lot of effort into it. I gently pushed the ball and watched it sway, the raindrops mixing with the creaking of the tree. That's when I noticed what was below it. Directly beneath the turf ball was an old tree stump. This wasn't just any stump, though. It looked like it had been worn down, smoothed out over time, and hollowed out. Inside, the hollowed space was filled with twigs, reeds, and wildflowers, arranged in a pattern that resembled the layers of a blooming flower. There were hundreds of tiny twigs, some bent into intricate shapes, creating a three-dimensional effect. I couldn't help but think it must have taken days to assemble. I didn't see any signs of missing grass around the clearing, so it seemed like someone had brought the turf ball from elsewhere. They might have even brought a ladder, because climbing a 20-foot oak tree isn't something just anyone would do. I thought maybe it was the work of an eccentric artist or some kind of guerrilla art installation. As I knelt to examine the tree stump, I noticed that not all the pieces were twigs. I picked up something that looked like an old bone and quickly realized that's exactly what it was. At first, I thought it was an animal bone, but then a thought crossed my mind. That bone could have come from a human finger or toe. It was a chilling thought, and I quickly dropped the bone. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to put it back exactly where I had found it. I was about to reach for my phone to take a picture when I swear I heard movement behind me, in the tree line. I spun around, hoping to see the person who had created the strange installation. But no one was there. It could have been an animal, but I didn't hear any more noise, just total silence. That's when the horrible feeling hit me. I felt like someone, or something, was watching me. Nervously, I called out a greeting, hoping it was the creator of the display. But again, silence. It wasn't just my imagination. I was certain something was there, but no one answered. I put my phone away, not daring to take any pictures. I had this deep, primal fear that if I turned my back, whatever was out there might take the chance to approach. If they'd been willing to use bones for their art, who knew what they would do to protect it? My nerves were getting the better of me. Eventually, I backed away from the clearing, walking faster and faster, my head turning constantly until I felt I was at a safe distance. But what was I safe from? The fear didn't go away, and as I walked, I couldn't help but question what I had just witnessed. I wanted to return and document it, but the fear of going back was stronger than my curiosity. I convinced myself it was just the work of some bored artist, and I had simply freaked myself out by picking up an old animal bone. That was the logical explanation, right? But even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I'm not one to believe in the supernatural. I'd like to think I could handle myself if I had to, but in that moment, every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave and never come back. Weeks later, I did return. It took that long for me to gather the courage, and when I did, it gave whoever had made that strange display enough time to remove it. The tree stump was empty, the turf ball had been cut down, and everything was gone. The place seemed even more unsettling now that it was empty, as if its disappearance made it even more mysterious. I thought maybe some kids had found it and vandalized it, but then I wondered, what if it was my discovery that caused it to be taken down? What if it was destroyed to hide something? What had been going on there, and what was so wrong that they had to erase it? I kicked at the remains of the tree stump, hoping to find one of the bones, but there was nothing. And once again, I felt that eerie sense of being watched. But this time, I backed away without feeling the same level of fear. I finished my walk, but I couldn't help thinking about what I had seen. That strange combination of the turf ball and tree stump remains the oddest, creepiest thing I've encountered on a hike, and probably the creepiest thing I've experienced in my entire life. Sure, on the surface, it looked like a bizarre yet artistic creation. But the more I think about it, the bones, the strange feeling of being watched, and the mystery of who would create such a thing, the more I'm relieved it's gone. Music. On Sunday, May 19, 1996, 26-year-old Carly Winters and 24-year-old Emily Blake embarked on a hiking adventure in the Blue Ridge Mountains, accompanied by Carly's golden retriever, Duke. Emily was from Duluth, Minnesota, while Carly hailed from a small town in rural Maine. Though they came from different backgrounds, both shared a deep love for nature and the outdoors. They had met nearly 2 years prior while volunteering at a now-closed organization in Minnesota that provided wilderness survival training and funded trips for women. Carly Winters, a fan of craft beer and outdoor activities, came from a well-off family in Michigan. After finishing high school, she left home to study wilderness guiding at Unity College in Maine. Carly was passionate about sharing the transformative power of nature with others, hoping to help them find themselves in the wild, just as she had. Emily, on the other hand, was a skilled geologist and former state champion tennis player in Minnesota. She later traveled to Spain to study prehistoric life and the extinction of dinosaurs. After graduating with honors, she found a job at a bookstore in Vermont. Her hiking trip through the mountains was meant to celebrate her new position, as she was set to start work on June 1, 1996. But Emily failed to show up for her first day, and soon, concerns arose. On May 31, 1996, after hearing nothing from Emily for over a week, her father, Thomas Blake, reported the two women missing. A search operation ensued, and the car they had been traveling in was discovered north of a lodge in the mountains. Bridget Arnold, a deputy chief ranger, later recalled that rangers quickly scoured the trails near the lodge. During the search, Carly's dog, Duke, was found roaming the park alone. The following evening, June 1st, 1996, rangers discovered the bodies of Carly and Emily near a campsite close to a horse trail. The women had been bound and gagged, with their throats cut. Investigators soon recovered the women's camera, which offered a glimpse into their last days. They had hiked up the White Oak Canyon Trail and had hitched a ride with a ranger after a weather change. Once the skies cleared, they summit Hawksbill Mountain, the highest peak in the region, and set up camp by a peaceful stream. Detectives concluded that hours after taking their final photographs, they were violently killed. The campsite was located only a quarter-mile from a popular scenic drive and half a mile from a well-frequented lodge, both of which would have been bustling with tourists and hikers during the Memorial Day weekend. The fact that no one had seen anything was puzzling, but park rules required campers to stay off established trails, which made them vulnerable to a potential killer. Tragically, Emily and Carly were not the first people to vanish in the nation's parks. Getting lost or encountering dangerous animals is not uncommon, but disappearances and murders in these places create a specific type of horror. Sally Montgomery, a park manager, admitted that the case shook everyone who worked there. "We don't have much crime in the park," she said, "but when we found those women, it was terrifying." The FBI joined forces with the Virginia State Police to investigate, but the challenges of working in a national park proved overwhelming. A park ranger explained that with over 1 million visitors each year, the transient nature of park guests made it difficult to pinpoint a suspect. A crime scene in the wild was also much larger than one at a residence, complicating efforts to gather evidence. The search for the killer generated over 15,000 leads, but by the following year, the case seemed to be fading into obscurity. That was until July 1997, when a frightening incident unfolded along Skyline Drive, a popular route in the park. Yvonne Miller, a cyclist from Canada, was forced off the road by a truck driven by a man later identified as Darryl Price. Yvonne said the man shouted obscenities before attempting to force her into his truck. She managed to escape, hiding behind a tree, but the man tried to run her over before fleeing. Park rangers arrested him as he attempted to leave the area. Price, a man in his late 20s from Columbia, Maryland, had no criminal record but had been fired from his job earlier that year due to his volatile behavior. Investigators found zip ties in his vehicle, suggesting he may have been planning to restrain victims. While little was known about Price at the time, interviews revealed concerning patterns of behavior, including a history of threatening and aggressive actions. Price was caught on security footage entering the park around the same time Emily and Carly were there, and his presence near the scene on June 1st raised suspicions. However, despite circumstantial evidence, Price denied being involved. Years passed, and the case went cold, but in 2001, a breakthrough came when the Virginia Attorney General announced that Price had been indicted for the murders. Prosecutors revealed disturbing statements Price had made, including his belief that women were more vulnerable and that the couple had deserved to die because of their sexuality. Despite the charges, the case faltered when DNA testing on evidence failed to match Price to the crime scene. By 2003, forensic tests on a single hair found at the scene confirmed that Price was not the killer, leading investigators to drop their focus on him. The case, however, remains open. As of the 20th anniversary of the crime, the FBI continues to seek information, hoping for a tip that could bring justice to the families of Emily and Carly. If they were still alive today, Emily and Carly would be nearing 50, likely still sharing their love of the outdoors. Their tragic deaths continue to haunt their loved ones and the rangers who worked in the park at the time. "When I learned they were geologists, it really hit home," said one former ranger. "They were out there just enjoying the rocks, and then something horrible happened. It changed the way I did my job and how I thought about the park." 2 decades have passed since Emily and Carly were killed, but their memory lingers in the hearts of those who knew them and those who continue to search for answers. I am a water scientist, which basically means I spent most of my 20s studying water without losing my mind from boredom. Kidding aside, it's actually way more fascinating than people think. If you get a solid degree from a reputable university, the job opportunities are pretty wide-ranging. We help farmers grow crops, ensure water treatment plants deliver clean water, and make sure that water reaches your home, safe and in good supply. We also assess rivers to determine if they can be dammed, aiming to harness green energy without damaging the environment too much. It was one of those assessment projects that led me to the wilderness of northern Washington during the summer of 2016. On paper, it was a sweet deal, a well-paying, high-stakes job that could determine the outcome of a multi-million-dollar government contract. Between you and me, though, it felt more like a paid hiking trip. The plan was simple: explore, examine the terrain, take notes. I estimated the work would take about 5 or 6 days, leaving plenty of time to enjoy the outdoors. I didn't even last 3 days. By the evening of the third day, I was sprinting out of the woods with only my car keys, phone, and a survival knife. Something is seriously wrong in the woods near Colville National Forest, and it's something no one talks about. My first day started in a small town called Cedar Creek. It was a quiet little place with one general store where I stopped for some last-minute supplies. When I asked the clerk for a safe place to leave my car, he kindly offered the free parking lot behind the store and assured me he'd keep an eye on it while I hiked into the pine-covered hills. The pines I was ready for, the hills not so much. I consider myself pretty fit, but those hills absolutely destroyed me. Even zigzagging up the slopes to ease the climb didn't help much. By the time I reached my first campsite, carrying all my gear felt like punishment. That night, I collapsed into my sleeping bag, completely drained. The second day was more of the same. Aching muscles, drenched in sweat, but I stayed optimistic, telling myself it was the workout of a lifetime. However, the smell. Oh, the smell. I was rank. I considered hiking down to the river to clean up, but I didn't want to get filthy again on the way back. So, I settled for baby wipes and promised myself a proper wash on day 3 when I'd refill my water supplies. On the third morning, I woke up with a pounding headache. I popped a couple of painkillers, laced up my boots, and headed into the trees to take care of nature's call. That's when I noticed something alarming. My pee was dark, like whiskey. I was dehydrated, having rationed my water a bit too carefully. Deciding it was time to fix that, I hiked straight down to the river. I guzzled water until I felt human again, stripped down to my boxers, and waded in for a much-needed rinse. As I was getting out, I thought I saw movement in the trees near where I'd left my clothes. It was subtle, like something brushing against the undergrowth. Maybe a breeze? Or maybe an animal. Spooked but not panicked, I grabbed my stuff and headed back to camp. Later that day, while hiking and taking notes, I caught a horrible stench in the air. At first, I thought it was me, but the further I walked, the stronger it got. Soon, the smell was so overpowering I had to stop to keep from gagging. That's when I saw it. A dead animal hanging in a tree. It was so mangled I couldn't tell if it had been a fox or a coyote. Someone had clearly killed it and strung it up. I assumed it was a crude way to scare off predators, but there weren't any farms around for miles. Then I noticed it wasn't the only one. As I moved, I saw more corpses, raccoons, rabbits, even what looked like half a deer skeleton, strung up in the trees. They were everywhere in various stages of decay. The smell was unbearable, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was surrounded. That was the breaking point. I didn't bother packing up my tent or gear. I just grabbed my essentials and bolted back to the car. I don't like to think about how much money I lost walking away from that job. It doesn't matter. No paycheck would ever convince me to go back to those woods. not after what I saw or what I felt. I studied biology in college, and one semester we had a guest lecturer join us. Her name was instantly recognizable. She was a renowned figure in orangutan conservation. After her lecture, we found out she was looking for 2 students to assist with a year-long research project abroad following graduation. The study would take place in a remote part of Borneo. I had always dreamed of traveling but never had the means, so having everything covered by the research program was a dream come true. Growing up in a small Midwestern town, I couldn't imagine anything more thrilling than venturing to Borneo, a lush tropical island in Southeast Asia, just below the Philippines. The opportunity was incredible, but it was far from easy. We started our days at 3:30 a.m., working 6 days on and 3 days off, spending around 14 to 15 hours daily in the dense, humid rainforest. Our job involved tracking wild orangutans and meticulously recording behavioral data every 2 minutes. Since they were completely wild, we maintained a safe distance and never attempted to touch them, ensuring our presence didn't interfere with their natural routines. That said, I had a few harrowing encounters. Over the course of my year there, I was charged 3 times by a dominant male orangutan. It was terrifying each time, though he never made contact. He only succeeded in making my heart race and my legs sprint. The work was both physically grueling and mentally draining. The constant onslaught of mosquitoes made the experience even more challenging. To top it off, we had no communication with the outside world except during our rare breaks. On those days, we'd trek nearly an hour to a specific spot in the jungle where we could occasionally catch a faint cell signal. Even then, it was barely enough to send a few short messages via WhatsApp. We typed them out, wait for the signal to cooperate, and send them all at once before switching our phones back to airplane mode to conserve battery life. One morning, after completing our usual routine, we set off into the jungle at sunrise. I was incredibly sleepy, struggling to stay alert, when suddenly, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. Ahead of us, crouched low in the undergrowth, was a clouded leopard. The animal was completely still, staring at us with piercing amber eyes. Both I and the other American researcher froze on the spot. Seeing a leopard was an extraordinary rarity, not only because of how endangered they are, but also because they generally avoid humans. At first, I thought it would just run off, but instead, it slowly rose and crept toward us. Fear hit me like a wave. Fortunately, one of our local guides pulled out a slingshot, aimed, and launched a stone near the leopard. The moment the rock landed, the leopard bolted back into the jungle. We stood there, trembling, for what felt like ages before the guide reassured us that it was likely a young leopard, curious about us and probably watching us throughout the night before crossing our path in the morning. If not for our guide's quick action, we might have been in real danger. We continued cautiously, though my nerves were on edge. The dense jungle canopy meant the light was dim even in the morning, with plenty of shadowy pockets among the trees. Feeling uneasy, I took out my flashlight to scan the darker areas. The first spot I checked revealed nothing. The second was clear too, but in the third, there it was. A pair of glowing eyes reflected the beam of my flashlight. I couldn't see the leopard fully, but its unmistakable silhouette was watching us from the shadows. This encounter drove home the risks of working in such an environment. Jungle research can be incredibly dangerous, and predators like big cats are only one of the many hazards. We couldn't safely proceed with a leopard potentially stalking us, especially since they're ambush hunters. Though theoretically, keeping an eye on it should deter an attack, the jungle is their territory, and they're masters of camouflage. One slip-up could have been catastrophic. In the end, the guide's expertise saved us once again, and we eventually managed to leave the area without further incident. That encounter remains the most frightening experience of my time in Borneo, a stark reminder of how unpredictable and unforgiving the wilderness can be. During my college years, I worked at a summer camp for youth explorers. This story happened during the summer after I graduated, making it the last time I ever worked there. Each week, I'd take a group of campers out to a spot in the forest for their wilderness survival badge. The activities included building a shelter out of branches and leaves to sleep in, learning to make a campfire, and cooking food over it. Though the spot felt remote, it was only about half a mile from the main camp, but we'd intentionally lead the campers in circles to make it seem more isolated. One evening, after the kids had built their shelters and we'd finished cooking dinner, we all gathered around the fire to sing songs and tell spooky stories. It was getting late, around 10 p.m., so I sent the campers to their makeshift shelters for the night and began extinguishing the fire as part of our safety procedures. That's when we heard it. A faint chime, like a distant bell. It rang out at intervals every 10 seconds or so, and lasted only a couple of minutes. The sound was subtle but distinct, and everyone, including the kids, noticed it. Since we'd been swapping scary stories, some of the kids started getting nervous, speculating about ghosts or other eerie explanations. I reassured them, saying it was likely just a late-night church service in a nearby town, even though deep down, I was unsettled too. Here's the thing, there wasn't supposed to be any town or church within 20 miles of our camp. I confirmed this later by checking a map and asking an older camp counselor about the area. He said there were no rural churches nearby. When I pressed further, asking why we might hear bells so deep in the forest, he gave me an uncomfortable look before saying he'd heard it before, but that it wasn't anything to worry about. That response actually made me more uneasy than anything else. At the time, I was mostly confused. Our camp was supposed to be well away from civilization. Still, the counselor's acknowledgement of the sound gave me some reassurance, until he abruptly canceled all future wilderness trips the next day. The other counselors were disappointed since the wilderness trips were a highlight of the camp experience, but they accepted it without much fuss. I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. If the bells were harmless, why cancel the trips? When I asked him about it, he said there had been several recent bear sightings and he didn't want to take any chances. It was a reasonable explanation. Bears were common in northern Idaho, especially after a wet spring, but something about his behavior made me doubt it. No one had reported seeing bears, nor were there any signs like claw marks or droppings. It didn't add up, but I didn't have the time or resources to investigate further. I liked and respected the head counselor and didn't want to accuse him of hiding something without proof. Plus, wandering around the woods alone to solve the mystery didn't seem like the safest idea. I never returned to the camp after that summer, and no incidents involving kids or staff ever occurred. To this day, I've never found an explanation for the eerie chiming or why the trips were abruptly canceled. It remains my go-to creepy story, one that lingers in my memory because it's still a complete mystery, even all these years later. Back in July of 2014, I was on a solo backpacking trip around the Oregon coast. I made stops at several places, including areas near the Clatsop State Forest. A few days into the trip, I stopped in a small town and ended up on a random gravel road that ended at a scenic spot along a riverbank. The view was breathtaking. There was an old wooden bridge crossing the river that looked straight out of a fantasy novel. The summer heat was intense, and after days without a proper wash, I was feeling far from clean. Seeing the cool, clear river in front of me was too tempting. I parked my car at the dead end, turned it around just in case I needed to leave quickly, and grabbed a towel. I didn't have a swimsuit with me, but figured a quick dip in my underwear wouldn't hurt. The area seemed utterly isolated, and I felt safe enough. Yet, as I approached the river, a faint unease started to creep in. A sense that something about this situation wasn't right. People always talk about the feeling of being watched, and while I'm not usually paranoid, I couldn't shake the discomfort. I brushed the feeling off as irrational and stepped into the river. The water was refreshing, and I started scrubbing off days of sweat and grime. But the unease lingered. After a few minutes, I decided to cut the bath short. As I walked up the embankment to where I'd left my towel and clothes, the unsettling feeling faded a little. Then I saw him. Across the river, slightly uphill from me, stood a man. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but no, it was a person. His clothing looked like it was handmade from animal hides, and his hair was long and matted, with strands tangled around twigs. He looked like he lived entirely off the land. We locked eyes, and my skin crawled. His presence wasn't just startling, it was menacing. Without saying a word, he began moving toward the bridge that spanned the river. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my shoes, towel, and car keys, but my clothes got caught in some brambles. Realizing I didn't have time, I left the clothes behind and bolted toward my car. As I scrambled through the blackberry bushes, I could hear him crossing the bridge. Reaching my car, I threw the door open and locked it just as he arrived. He slammed his hands against the hood, screaming and grunting incoherently. When he moved toward the driver's side door, I hit the gas and sped off. In the rearview mirror, I saw him chasing after the car, his figure growing smaller as I gained distance. He pursued me for nearly a mile before vanishing from sight. I was bleeding from scratches, soaked, and trembling as I drove away. Even now, years later, I can still feel the terror of that moment. I truly believed I was being hunted. I've never returned to that area, and I never hike alone anymore. That day changed me forever, and though therapy has helped, the memory is still vivid. I've spent most of my life living in the Appalachians, always in pretty remote areas. It's always peaceful, quiet, and surrounded by forests. One evening, a few years ago, I was sitting on my porch around midnight, sipping a beer and soaking in the stillness of the night. If you've never lived out in the countryside during summer, you might not realize how noisy nature can be after dark. The crickets chirp, frogs croak, and occasionally, you'll catch the sounds of other wildlife. It's like nature's version of a sound machine. Sometimes it's calming, but other times, the wild throws something at you that'll send chills down your spine. So, this one particular night, I'm just sitting there, beer in hand, with the constant hum of the woods in the background. Suddenly, everything stopped. The noise didn't fade out gradually. It just ceased all at once, as if someone had hit a mute button. The quiet was so thick that you could hear a leaf fall yards away. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the most horrifying sound I've ever experienced. It came from about 20 or 30 feet ahead of me in the trees. It was an ear-piercing, blood-freezing scream, like nothing I'd heard before. I knew it wasn't a cougar or anything like that. I've heard those before, and they tend to avoid human activity. This scream had something eerily human about it, yet I was certain no person could make a sound like that, at least not a sane one. I didn't stick around to investigate. I calmly got up, walked into the house, and stationed myself by the front window with my shotgun within arm's reach. I sat there, keeping an eye on the yard, until I eventually drank enough to stop feeling scared. That was the first and only time I ever heard a sound like that, and I sincerely hope I never hear it again. Some folks have suggested it could have been a large owl, since they're known to make some unsettling noises at night. But I'm telling you, there's no way that was an owl. Whatever it was, it sounded massive, not like a bird. It didn't repeat the cry either. It let out one long, haunting scream and then moved off into the woods. Unless we've got some kind of mutant owl that moves on 4 legs or 2, it wasn't a bird. I don't live in that area anymore, and honestly, I'm grateful. Whatever came that close to me that night, I hope it stays far, far away from where I am now.